We have to remember that food is just one component, and we can't let other things like physical activity, sleep, stress management, and social community engagement, we can't discount how important that is as well. For better health, I think we just need to focus on what does self-care look like. If you're not sleeping well, then the food isn't going to just maybe not do its job the way it should. If you're not looking at stress management and admitting that you have stress and maybe even getting some therapy to help you with that, that's not going to help with the food component. So I think we put such an importance on food. I'm a dietitian, so I'm biased to say that food's so important, but there's a big world outside of food that impacts the food.
All right, welcome back to the Better Human podcast. Today we've got an amazing guest, Kristin Kirkpatrick. How are you?
Hi, Greg. I'm doing great. How are you today?
Excellent. We're going to chat about health and regenerative medicine today and what we could all do to be way healthier as human beings in 2024. So I'm excited about today's episode. And your most recent book called Regenerative Health, Discover Your Metabolic Type and Renew Your Liver for Life. So let's jump right into this. Let me start with the big question or the first question, which is, what is a metabolic type? What is a metabolic profile and how do I learn more about that?
Right, sure. So, as a dietitian, I've been a dietitian for over 21 years. And I think like in the beginning of my career, it was always the focus on BMI. BMI was always kind of the dictator of what you ended up doing with a patient. But over time, we've learned that BMI is really a poor assessment of overall health. So when we looked at metabolic type, what we really looked at was what was the combination between your waist circumference, which is a better indicator, and then some of your metabolic profile numbers. So what does your lipid panel look like? What about your hemoglobin A1C, which is that 3-month marker of blood sugar management? Glucose, liver enzymes. So we kind of combined all of that together to say, here, this is your metabolic type, and here's how we should approach this type versus your BMI is 26, you're overweight, and let's just focus on weight loss.
Yeah, and BMI, just for the audience, is body mass index. Is that
body
correct?
Mass index, yep. The ratio between your weight in kilograms to your height. So again, I've worked with a lot of individuals that are athletes. They're really high in muscle. Their BMI is going to be higher, right? Because muscle is going to weigh more than fat. So it's just not a great indicator of this. And then in addition to that, I think we have a little bit of let's say fat shaming when we have someone whose BMI is 30, 31, 32, then we start putting them into these classes of obesity. So that can be problematic as well. So really focusing more on where's the more dangerous fat that you're carrying, that midsection, and then what else is going on in your health. That's a better assessment.
Yeah, and there's two types of fat, if I'm correct, which is the fat around your organs. I forget what that's called. And then the fat that you could sort of, grab and pinch, right?
Yeah. Well, actually referring to like looking at visceral fats. So
visceral fats, exactly.
Yeah. And the ones around your organs, one of the things we said in our book was that it creates really this like cytokine storm, right? So when we have fat around the midsection, it's really active. We're releasing cytokines. We're more likely to have an increase in inflammation versus the thighs, the hips, the butt area. That's the type of fat that is not as close to organs. It is close to the portal vein. So that's a little bit different, but it's not as close to organs. So we don't see as much of the danger. And I think that's why this connection between waist circumference is really important.
Right. So let's go back to metabolic types. So how many types are there and what are the differences?
Yeah. So we came up with 4 different metabolic types. So essentially we start with looking at whether or not you are healthy and lean. So that's one type. So your waist circumference, if you're a female, it's 35 or under. If you're a male, it's 40 or under. Okay. So that's kind of the barometer there. You don't have any other sort of metabolic abnormality. So you're healthy, lean, even if you have a little bit of pre-diabetes or your hemoglobin A1C is slightly high, still in that category. Then we get into your healthy, so your numbers look pretty good, but you're non-lean. So the waist is starting to get a little bit larger than what we consider the norm. Then we look at the next 2, which is going to be non-lean, non-healthy. That's going to be another indicator where, okay, our numbers are really off. This is kind of like, not to use the word the worst, but this is the most aggressive approach we're going to take when you're non-lean, non-healthy. That's a really important one. And then unhealthy and lean would be the last one. So your numbers are not looking really great, but your waist circumference is still okay. Sometimes we refer to that as like the skinny fat individuals, where they just, their waist circumference is fine, but like their cholesterol is out of control, or their triglycerides are out of control, their liver enzymes are out of control. Something else is going on.
Right. So you mentioned liver. So one of the things that you talked about in your first book, which was sort of fatty liver disease. And I'm sorry, I got a little bug around me being Costa Rican here. So fatty liver disease being the silent epidemic, right? So talk us through that.
Yeah. So non-alcoholic fatty liver disease impacts, we think, a quarter of individuals worldwide. And that's looking at whether you're diagnosed or not diagnosed. And then the other really scary statistic with this is that if you've got insulin resistance or you have type 2 diabetes, because non-alcoholic fatty liver disease is so tightly tied to metabolic health, you're 75% likely to have it as well. So when we look at this concept of non-alcoholic fatty liver disease, the non-alcoholic is a key factor here. This is not created by alcohol consumption, which is kind of the thought that a lot of people have. Well, I don't drink. Why do I have fatty liver? But what we know is that it's tightly regulated to what the liver does and how it is being abused, or how the liver is starting to degrade because of other abnormalities in your metabolic type. So, it's interesting. One of the things that has occurred over the past year, even since we wrote the book, so this came towards the end of it, is the liver organizations have renamed non-alcoholic fatty liver disease to metabolic associated dysfunction fatty liver disease, because it's so tightly tied to the metabolic. So it affects a lot of people. I started getting into this because I had so many patients that would show up and say, hey, my liver enzymes are up. My doctor says I'm obese. I've got fatty liver disease, right? They haven't even really officially tested for it, but they assume they have it. So that's how prevalent it is. It's a preventative condition, obviously, and it's a reversal that we can look at. But once we get into the latter stages of non-alcoholic fatty liver disease, which, by the way, I should have started with this, it's just going over how much fat is in the liver. So about 5 to 10% is going to be pretty normal in the liver. Once we get above that, the fat gets too great. And so once we get more fat, it starts replacing healthy tissue. And once too much healthy tissue is taken over, our liver is just not going to function the way it should, right? We need to have that liver. So that's really what we focused on in the first book. In the second book, we are more about like, hey, let's look at what you as a person really look at in terms of your own health, and how do we address this to reverse this condition.
Yeah. So what would be some symptoms that, like, if someone hasn't gotten a test, how would maybe someone sort of cue up or tee up to the fact of, oh, maybe I should go get my liver tested and find out sort of where I sit with that?
Yeah, so this is the challenge, is that it's really asymptomatic unless you're in the latter stages. So if you're in that latter stages, that healthy liver tissue is being replaced, you'll start seeing things like itchy skin. You could just have actual pain in that region. You could start developing jaundice, right? So we would think about jaundice as something kids get, but when you look at bilirubin, liver dysfunction, you can get jaundice as an adult as well. Fatigue. I always say, like, most of my patients are postmenopausal women. Most of them are fatigued. They'll tell me that all the time. I'm exhausted, right? So sometimes it will mimic other things, or you might just kind of discount it. But really, the only way to know you have this is to either get a biopsy, which we don't do as much because it's invasive, or an ultrasound. So what happens is a patient goes to go see their physician. Their liver enzymes might be a little bit elevated, and that might be the tip for the liver to say, for the doctor to say, okay, you know what, your liver enzymes are a little off, something's going on. You probably have the beginning stages of this condition. This is more likely to occur than someone going in and finding out that they have liver cancer because they've had NAFLD for 20 years.
Interesting. So, I mean, we talk about sort of all the bad things that we do to create fatty liver disease. And I'm probably guilty of some of them, including drinking too much wine. But what could we do are there foods, are there supplements, are there things I could add into my lifestyle which are going to start to help counterbalance or at least promote a healthy liver?
Yeah. So I think number one, just kind of focusing really high level. This is true for many conditions and many organs that we look at within the body. Just having a diet that is really high in nutrient density, that seems like easier said than done. So a lot of times what I'll tell my patients is instead of just getting crazy and just becoming obsessed with a certain diet, why don't we just eat more color? Right? So that's kind of tip number one that I give people. So let's have like 7 different colors today. And people usually are like, oh, that's impossible. Like, who has that kind of time? But then when you break down how easy that is, like, okay, if you have steel cut oats in the morning and you put some blueberries and strawberries, that's 3 colors. And I'm asking you to get 7, you got the rest of the day. So just getting more colors means you're getting more plants, and getting a wide variety of colors means a wide variety of phytonutrients, antioxidants, flavonoids, et cetera, right? So getting that in there. I think really looking at, again, if your waist circumference is high, and especially if you've got some abnormalities going on with your blood sugar, maybe looking at what your carbohydrate content is and reducing that. So that doesn't mean we have to cut carbs completely and we can never have bread. But what I talk about is really looking more at having smarter carbohydrates. So having carbs that are always attached to fiber. Whole grain oats would be a great example. Fruits and vegetables, great example, right? So anytime you eat something, make sure fiber's attached to it, right? So now we have colors, get more color. We've got have fiber attached to something. And then I think sometimes we lose this in translation, but the studies are very clear. If we don't follow our personal, our religious, our cultural preferences, we're not going to sustain any dietary pattern, right?
Right.
So I've had patients come to me and they're like, oh, you're going to make me eat kale. And, they have this sad face. And I'm always like, no, I mean, if you don't love kale, that's no problem. But let's find something else in the cruciferous family that maybe you do like. Because if you eat kale, you're eating it for me, and that won't be sustainable. So, always tapping into that. What do you like? What do you enjoy? What comes from your childhood that you can bring in? What comes from your culture? I know in Costa Rica, I'm half Dominican. I spent most of my summers in Dominican Republic. And I just remember the cultural foods that I had there that were so different than what we get here in the United States.
Correct.
And so kind of how do I bring that in as an individual? I think that's always really important too. But more plants, less food overall, less carbs, that alone is going to help your liver really thrive a little bit more.
Cool. I think it's so difficult in today's world. I mean, we're inundated with like, eat this diet, do this. I mean, what are your thoughts on like, the whole organ meat and the whole carnivore diet and the stay away from greens? But one of the things I learned years ago was if your plate is colorful, and I like what you said there, it's a healthy plate, right? If you look at your plate and everything is beige, that's a problem. If you look at your plates and there's multiple colors, then that's probably a good thing because you're adding in those fruits, those vegetables and stuff. But, I mean, how do we know who to listen to in some cases? And being a dietitian and having the history that you do, what are your thoughts about all these different, call it diets or fads, or, this thought leader standing up saying you should eat organ meats and that's the only thing you should eat?
Yeah, it's really challenging. It's interesting. So one of the things that I do in my business is I write for the Today Show, and my editor asked me a few weeks ago to do an assessment on the carnivore diet. It's exactly what you asked about, right? And so I was talking to a few other dietitians, and they're like, "Oh, how could you write that? Like that's like so unhealthy." But you have to give a perspective, right? And I think at the end of it, and this is probably based on being at the Cleveland Clinic my entire career, there's not multiple studies backing up a dietary approach. It's not something I probably would recommend. So I think we always have to start with the science. That's a little bit more challenging for today's consumer because people are watching people on social media. Again, to your point, they don't know what's right, what's wrong, who to listen to. But one of the things I always say is if you're really interested in someone, ask for the science. Ask for a breakdown of the data that is supporting the claims or some of the discussions that this expert is having. If an expert has it, they're going to be happy to send it to you, right? And then we get into kind of the second bucket of that, which is determining what's a good study versus a bad study. I oftentimes I joke that I have like PTSD from like my research methods classes in grad school because they
all
were
the studies
so hard.
Right.
But it was the most valuable training I got. So I think like if we follow the science that and we understand the science, that's a really good approach. And also know that there's really no one size fits all approach. Right.
Right.
Even within our book, we have a lot of different dietary recommendations. But the one thing that we say is that you can take pieces and parts of all of our different approaches and make it what you want. So even if you look at something like the carnivore diet, or you look at paleo or even keto, there are pieces and parts of those diets that might work really well for individuals. You don't have to follow the whole diet aggressively day in and day out. So I
Right.
think we need to get back to kind of giving ourselves a break, if you will,
Right.
uh, and losing kind of the bad relationship we have with food, because that's really where it's all based in.
Yeah. I actually want to talk a little bit about sort of, how food is manufactured and processed just generally in North America and what your thoughts are there. But before we go there, um, I like what you said, which is, not going extreme. I'll just paraphrase, which is like going all in on this one diet. I mean, I think, as an individual, understanding your body type, your metabolic type, sort of what does work for you, your cultural sort of background. Yeah, I'm sure you've heard of the blue zones, and I don't
Yep.
know if you've seen that recent documentary on Netflix that, kind
Yeah.
of wants to come. And what was cool about that is they compared all the blue zones, right? And said, okay, what are sort of the overlapping sort of nuances or similarities that we can start to see? And food was one of them. And the basic thing, even though they were different foods, the food was healthy. It was fresh. It was workful. People were physically active, all that kind of good stuff. So back to how food is manufactured in North America. One of the big things that's been popping up lately is seed oils, right? And how bad they are for you. And I think this is the challenge. You go to the restaurant, not everyone is going to walk in there and say, listen, are you using this ingredient? Are you cooking it in this way?
Right.
But are seed oils bad for you? And what should I replace that with, or what should I be aware of?
Yeah. So, in some ways it depends on the processing of the seed oil. So that's kind of number one, right? You could say that there are some better quality canola oils than others. You could also say that for oils that we know have a lot of efficacy in the data, such as extra virgin olive oil,
Right.
right? We know that kind of we could talk for hours about this one, but we know that extra virgin olive oil, we know that the industry of olive oil is a little bit corrupted in
Hmm.
terms of making sure that what you're getting in the bottle is actually like that high polyphenol content. When was it pressed? When was it taken from the plant, et cetera? I don't really recommend seed oils to my patients, definitely not in large amounts. And I think one of the reasons for that is because there is so much data on very high quality extra virgin olive oil. And when people come back to me and kind of push back and say, well, but what about the smoke point? All right, I
Hmm.
can't do a lot of things with the smoke point of extra virgin olive oil. My response is always that anytime you're going to really cook at very high heat, regardless of the oil, it can turn a good fat into a bad fat. So that challenge is going to exist no matter what. But with the seed oils, we have an environment in where we're more likely to get some more omega 6s. And we know that when our omega 6s are out of balance with our omega 3s, that can cause inflammation. So really the question is, again, based on the science, what's the inflammatory impact that seed oils can have? I think if seed oils are like 5 to 10% of your overall diet, you're going to throw in some canola oil, or maybe you're going to put some sesame oil over something. It's fine. But if it's the only oil that you're using and you're not utilizing things like extra virgin olive oil, that's when it can be problematic. So it's all about the really kind of the quality of it, which again is hard for the average consumer to determine. And then how much of it are you actually using?
Right. So let's go to extra virgin oil, or olive oil. What should I look for? Is there a brand that you recommend? Is there a label that when I'm looking at the label, I'm trying to look for something specific? And what is that?
Yeah. Extra virgin olive oil is really an interesting one. I've got a passion for this one. I actually wrote an article about this just a few weeks ago. But number one, you want to look at things like the harvest date. So you actually want to be within about 18 months of a harvest date. So if the harvest date is like 2 years prior, it's just not something you're going to want to look for. Number two, how is extra virgin olive oil stored at the grocery store? So if it's in like a clear container, heat, light, air, those are going to be kind of the killers of all the polyphenol content of extra virgin olive oil. So that's not going to be a great option either. So you want to look for, okay, let's get something that's not see-through. Let's get something that's a darker bottle, etc. A first pressing is always going to have like really the highest polyphenol content, right? Because you're taking that off and then you're actually pressing right then and there versus having it stored for a while, etc. The place where the olive oil is produced can sometimes be telling as well. So this is not to say that olive oils that are created outside of California are all bad. They're not. There's some great quality olive oils in Europe, in Africa, great quality oils. But we know that the regulations and some of the olive oils coming out of California tend to be a little bit higher quality, meaning that you got extra virgin olive oil in there and there's no other oils that are mixed in. Right. So I think the place that you're actually deriving it from can make a difference, right? That's a big one as well. And then really the polyphenol content, I was doing an olive oil tasting a few months ago. And so the grower, this was really interesting. He was saying that the polyphenol content is really, you can literally see it. So the more dark, the more green the oil is, the more likely it's going to have that really high antioxidant capacity versus a lighter oil. And then of course, going for like the extra virgin, right? You don't want to go with regular olive oil, going for that extra virgin. So I'd say California, how is it bottled? And again, I say this all the time, just ask questions. Find a company that you love. One of the companies I love is Cobran Estate. They're out of California. So find a company you love and then pound them with questions. Hey, do you have any research? Can you tell me your process? That makes us like more able to kind of take control over our health because we're asking the questions that information might not just be provided if we hadn't asked.
And polyphenol is contributes to or provides antioxidants. Is that correct?
Provides antioxidants. We talked a lot about this in regenerative health, but in general, the more polyphenols you have, the more ability you have to reduce overall inflammation. And inflammation is the base of any disease, whether that's mental health or that's physical health, right? So it was really interesting. Deepak Chopra just did an interview and he said something that is just stuck in my mind. I just can't get this out. And he said that inflammation is the greatest pandemic
Correct.
of our time, right?
Yeah.
It was really like interesting to hear him say that. But then he went into kind of the mental health aspect of it, that people that have experienced trauma, mental health, adverse mental health are more likely to be inflamed.
Right.
And so it's like, and that gets into nutritional psychology, but it's something that most dietitians are not trained in. Mm-hmm. So we're just trained in the physical health, which obviously is important, but the mental health, we know that extra virgin olive oil can contribute to better mental health as well.
Amazing. So just teaspoon of extra virgin olive oil every day, right? We'll help
I would do 3 tablespoons, Greg. I did that there was a study looking at 3 tablespoons. So actually I will down 3 tablespoons. Usually I'll get enough like in salads or I'll drizzle it. But if I'm having a busy day, kids, I'm running around, there's baseball, I'll just put it in a spoon, take it down.
Oh, that's so simple. All right. So I recently heard something about hydrogen water. Do you know anything about that?
I don't know much about it. I have had some patients ask me about it. I don't know enough to really comment on it, but I will say this, like, I think like water in its pure state is pretty good. And like sometimes when we start adding things to it, I don't know. I don't know if it makes it any better. It definitely ups the price, but
well, maybe that's your next research piece for the Today Show, which is hydrogen water and
hydrogen water. Right?
Yeah,
or even looking at like alkaline water and like, again, like where's the science behind it? That's what I would say.
So I used to be pretty sort of heavy on alkaline water. In fact, there's an awesome company in North America. It's called Flow Water, highest alkaline water out of all of them. And I for years and years and years. And then I heard, by the way, it doesn't really matter because your body can't process all that alkaline and you need to go through hydrogen water. So this is recent for me. And I'm a water guy. And, at the end of the day, it's, I think, wait a minute, like, I think you want to be drinking the best water out there. 70% water ourselves. So let's make sure that we're getting in there. Anyway, I'd love to circle back on that one with you. All right. So you also talk a lot about the 12 liver-friendly foods. And I know you said, listen, like, eat nutrient-dense food, but more specifically, what can I add into my diet out of those 12 specific liver-friendly foods?
Yeah, so I would say obviously the high level, eat more plants. I think the things that people aren't thinking of in terms of, again, the data and the research related to liver health, coffee is a huge beneficial food to overall liver health, right? Yeah, and I'm
I
drinking
drink
coffee.
lots of coffee every day.
Yeah, me too. Me too. Right. So coffee is like, I think it's predicted that coffee is the greatest source of antioxidants globally. Of course, I always say like, that's probably because more people drink coffee than eat broccoli, but coffee just has all of those bioactive compounds. And there's probably 6 to 7 very strong studies looking at the benefit to liver, especially non-alcoholic fatty liver disease with coffee consumption. Another one people I think might be surprised to hear about is dark chocolate. So again, there's a whole variety, there's a whole spectrum, right, of like where your dark chocolate is going to fall in terms of the benefits. But again, we're talking about flavonoids. So coffee, dark chocolate, we're still going back to plants. I always say, like, not to bash Hershey's, but it's the best example I can give is that, like, Mr. Hershey gets a hold of that cocoa bean and unfortunately doesn't do some good stuff with it. But if you get a company that does the best, keeps it dark, keeps that cocoa content high, that's going to be really beneficial. Cruciferous vegetables in particular, so looking at things that have like sulforaphane, like broccoli, for example, that tends to be very beneficial to the liver as well. Green tea, so if we're staying with the kind of drink, green tea, water, coffee, all of those are really great. Nuts and seeds. So again, like there is this theme that I'm looking at more plant-based, but we also see a lot of benefit with poultry and then wild fatty fish as well. So there's a lot to be said for omega-3s that are marine-based. Not to say that flaxseed walnuts that have alpha linoleic acid are not good. They're great. But the studies are really strong looking at DHA and EPA from omega-3s, which are derived from fatty fish, and then the benefit to reducing overall inflammation in the liver.
Yeah. You keep mentioning plant-based, and I want to ask, what are your thoughts on some of these plant-based products like the Impossible Burger, right? Which is heavily based in soy, lots of seed oils. I think if we're not careful, it's being presented as a healthy hamburger.
Right.
But I mean, thoughts on that?
Yeah. So it's interesting. It's like the question I get a lot from patients is, if I'm going to have a burger twice a month, am I just better with the real thing? And I think the answer might be yes. Right. So just kind of looking at, all right, well, let's look at where you get good quality meat. Let's look at wild beef. Let's look at bison. Let's look at grass finished, not just grass fed, but grass finished. So it's kind of like looking at that perspective. But with some of these plant-based burgers, we still have a high amount of processing. So that's really where the challenge comes in, is really kind of, again, back to the consumer education. So are you someone who is really looking towards reducing saturated fat, or are you looking to reduce sodium? You might not necessarily get that with some of these more processed burger options. So I think one of the things that I always look at is, and this is really, I kind of steal this from Michael Pollan, right? So Michael Pollan defined food as something that comes from nature, is fed from nature, and will eventually rot. So anytime we look at what we're going to put in our body, does it meet those 3 criteria? All right. So a lot of these processed plant-based burgers, not all of them, but a lot of them, not everything is going to be derived from nature.
Right.
Right. So it's like just kind of looking at that perspective and what works. And I think it also is based on the frequency. So if you're someone who's just really struggling to reduce your overall consumption of red meat or red processed meat, maybe they're a good crutch for a small amount of time. But I don't know if I would say that they're
Healthy.
always a healthier version. It just depends.
Yeah. And I think back to what you were talking about before, as a consumer, we need to be well researched, and we need to ask a lot of questions, and we need to,
Right.
lean into the stuff. I think, there is a lot of expertise out there from a food standpoint. Food is medicine in a lot of cases. And keep it simple. Does it come from nature? Is it colorful?
Simple. Eat more food.
Yeah. Yeah, simple, simple, simple. All right, I got a couple more questions for you. One of them being, which is brown fat. You say
Yeah.
is good fat. What is brown fat versus,
Yeah.
is there white fat?
Yeah, there's white fat, which is the fat that we don't want, right? So white fat is kind of like the fat we talked about that is in around our organs. It's what gives us belly fat. Brown fat has more of a thermic effect to it. So it actually helps with increasing our metabolism, so giving us energy, more efficient actually at burning the white fats, a little bit more challenging to get. Right. So there's some studies, we talked about this a little bit in our book. There are some studies that show that there are some methods to try and increase brown fat. We always are seeing new studies, but resveratrol was one study that we saw really kind of like looking at some of those components. But for the most part, when we look at the combination of brown fat and white fat, we don't have a lot of brown fat as the standard American diet doesn't include it really in terms of giving us opportunities to increase it. And as Americans, if we stay with Americans, we're much more likely to have the other type of fat. So there's still kind of new research that we're looking at, even though this has been around for years. I was actually looking last night at some new data, looking at individuals that are on GLP-1 agonist drugs, so Ozempic and Wegovy, and some preliminary data showing that might actually help to increase brown fat and might help to spur brown fat and the benefits that brown fat has. So it's very, very early research, right? We still have to see if that's true. But you want more brown fat, you want less white fat. Much easier to get the white fat. Much easier.
Right. So if someone wanted to go and do a test right now, what test should they go do? And where can they do some of those tests to get some of these data points to see where do they sit within all these levels?
Yeah. So I think if we're talking just basic liver health, most primary care physicians at your annual wellness visit are going to run your liver panel. So ALT and AST would be your greatest indicators of what your liver looks like. Without doing any of those invasive tests. And then, of course, we can look at, remember, go back to that statistic that if you're insulin resistant, type 2 diabetic, you're about 75% likely to also have non-alcoholic fatty liver disease. So making sure you have a good grasp on what your blood sugar health is, right? So what's your insulin? What's your glucose? That hemoglobin A1C, I think, is a really key number, because our glucose number that we get drawn is just a piece in time. It's just one little data point in time. And maybe you weren't fasting, or maybe you were. Whereas the hemoglobin A1C gives you a 3-month marker. So it gives you that trending of what your blood sugar looks like. So I'd say it's kind of twofold, right? Like, let's look at what's our basic liver enzymes, which is a basic test that you're going to get in your complete metabolic panel with your physician. And then a step further, what does it look like for our blood sugar management? And why would I care about that? Right. So women that are becoming peri and postmenopausal, their blood sugar management, it gets a little bit not as efficient. Right. So making sure that really at the end of the day, we're simply seeing our doctor. We're going to go see our doctor once a year. Right. Like, not to bash men, but I feel like it's the constant conversation I have with my husband. You have not seen your doctor in 2 years. Oh, yeah, I'll get to it. Right. So I think we need
They're afraid to go to the doctor. Yeah, they're
afraid to go to the doctor, afraid to see those numbers.
Right.
But, we don't want fear to turn into disease that could have been prevented. So I think we need to look at all of the phrases in our health and in our life that we're saying, I'll get to it, and determine what's the priority. What are the things that we're really never getting to? Going to see your doctor will check that box of checking out what your numbers are, and then you can deal with it instead of kind of putting your head in the sand.
And that's done through a blood test?
Yeah. So blood test is the way that your doctor would assess your blood sugar management, as well as those liver enzymes. Just a basic blood panel that, again, is pretty common in most physician offices.
Well, I'm actually looking for my lab results. I recently went through a lot of functional medicine tests, and I had my whole panels done, and I was going to see if I could find it and then go over them with you. But the doctor said I was fine back then, so I'm assuming everything's okay.
Yeah.
And I can find it. All right. So, Kristin, this has been super interesting. As we were saying earlier, I think the challenge in the world today is we're just inundated with information. So I think what I appreciate about today's conversation is it's really distilling down some thought from what we're overexposed to, and keep it simple when it comes down to food. Keep it colorful, right? Go to the doctor, right? Tell your husbands to go to the doctor, and there's things that we could add into our lifestyle, and this is really what regenerative medicine is, right? I mean, it starts with food. So very cool. I think your work is so important. All right, I know we're coming to the top of the hour. Let's drop some of your information. I mean, if people wanted to pick up your first book and second book, what are the names? Where can they find that? And then if they wanted to learn more about some of the work that you're doing or get in touch with you, how do they do that?
Yeah, I think, probably the best way is to just go to my website, which is my name, Kristin spelled with an I. So it's just KristinKirkpatrick.com. All of my social handles are Fuel Well with Chrissy, because again, like if you're fueling well, you're going to feel well. So there's a nutritional psychology slant to my socials. But really, Amazon is probably the best way to pick up either of the books. The first book was Skinny Liver. So that was just really delving into non-alcoholic fatty liver disease. What does the liver do? What's kind of the magic behind it? Why is this a concern? And then the second book, Regenerative Health, which is coming out, but it's there for pre-order right now, is really diving more into the dietary concerns of it as well. So those are the easiest ways to do that.
When does it officially launch?
February 21st.
Wow, very exciting. Very exciting. Very soon. So for the audience, get your pre-order in there now, because I'm sure they're going to go very quickly. All right, Kristin, this was very cool. I really appreciate your time. At the end of the episode, we come to the most important question, which is the better human question, but this is a health episode, so we're going to flip this to better health. So for the audience and for all of us moving forward in life, what do you think we could all do to have better health as of tomorrow?
Yeah. So I think even though food is the key, and this is what our conversation has been dominated on, we have to remember that food is just one component, and we can't let other things like physical activity, sleep, stress management, and social community engagement. I stole that from the Blue Zones, right? We can't discount how important that is as well, right? So I think again, for better health, I think we just need to focus on what does self-care look like? And we need to focus on all of those aspects. If you're not sleeping well, then the food isn't going to just maybe not do its job the way it should. If you're not looking at stress management and admitting that you have stress and maybe even getting some therapy to help you with that, that's not going to help with the food component. So I think we put such an importance on food. I'm a dietitian, so I'm biased to say that food is so important, but there's a big world outside of food that impacts the food.
Yeah,
so I think that's really the suggestion I would make. And I think just there was a study I saw, I think it was a few weeks ago, looking at stress management and lowering stress for people that smiled more.
Mm-hmm.
Just notice when I'm out at the store or whatever, when I smile at someone, usually I get a smile back.
Yep.
Right?
If you don't, that's okay too.
And that's okay too, right? It's more for me than for them. But I think just smiling more and kind of getting that perspective, helping to kind of bring down the cortisol of a really stressful day, just smiling and having a moment for yourself sometimes can be really beautiful.
Yeah, I totally agree. Smiling and laughing and being social and community. I talk a lot about this, community is really important. All right, Kristin, this was amazing. To the audience, KristinKirkpatrick.com if you want to go check out all of her social handles and information. Hop on Amazon, get that pre-order going. The book is called Regenerative Health, Discover Your Metabolic Type and Renew Your Liver for Life. Love it. And if you like today's episode, don't forget to like, don't forget to subscribe, don't forget to share, and we will see you next week.